Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today, Brazil's uncertain future. Latin America's largest economy has been through quite a lot in the past few years, more than its share, really. From the worst ever economic recession in Brazil to an Amazon literally on fire, and of course, the disastrous, one of the world's worst, COVID-19 pandemic experiences. And at the country's helm is Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right populist president facing a very uncertain re-election campaign next year. I'm talking to a man who once sat in that hot seat himself, former Brazilian President Henrique Cardoso. Then a look at poverty and hunger in Brazil, only made worse by the pandemic. And don't worry, I've also got your puppet regime.
It seems like things are not going great. Are you worried? Ha! What do you mean? Things are going fantastic.
But first, they call him the Trump of the tropics. Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, president, secured a huge victory in 2018, winning his election with more than 55% of the vote in a deeply polarized nation. And indeed, Bolsonaro and Trump became fast friends, even dining together at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. Bolsonaro's campaign echoed Trump's own run in 2016. He had his own drain the swamp take on fighting crime and corruption, controversial views, to say the least, on women and the LGBT community, deep support for and from Brazil's military. But since his inauguration in 2019, Bolsonaro has faced and at times created one huge fire after another. First, the economy. Brazil still feeling the impact of its worst ever recession, which began in 2014. Bolsonaro promised to turn that around, but economic growth in Brazil remains low and unemployment very high. Then you've got actual fires raging in the Amazon during Brazil's dry season. Rapid deforestation accounts for 1/3 of the destruction of the world's tropical forests in 2019 alone. President Trump was willing to look the other way on this environmental tragedy. He was kind of a climate skeptic himself, but the Biden administration, not so much. And finally, the COVID pandemic. Bolsonaro's handling of the biggest public health crisis of our lifetimes has been disastrous, one of the world's worst. He downplayed the severity, refused to support mask wearing, mishandled the vaccine rollout. As the pandemic took hold, Bolsonaro offered an emergency stipend in Brazil that temporarily helped the country's poorest citizens, but 55% of the Brazilian population faced food insecurity in 2020. About twice as many Brazilians went hungry last year than the number in 2018, before Bolsonaro was elected, and hunger remains a huge problem. Bolsonaro is up for re-election next year, and it's going to be an incredibly interesting and divisive campaign. The likely challenger is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Just call him Lula. Everyone else does. He's as far left as Bolsonaro is right. Bolsonaro got elected in 2018 as an alternative to 14 years of rule by Lula's Workers' Party. Now, Bolsonaro will be able to run against Lula directly. Will the Trump of the tropics see his political fortunes cool down? It's hard to say, because this is where the whole Trump-Bolsonaro comparison comes to a screeching halt. The United States has a two-party system. Brazil has around 24 political parties, making consensus building for both candidates far more complicated. How does Brazil recover from this devastating pandemic, and what's on the political horizon in 2022? I sat down with a guy who knows a thing or two about getting elected in Brazil. He did it twice. In fact, he was the first Brazilian president ever to win re-election. Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Here is our conversation. President Cardoso, so happy to welcome you on GZERO World.
Thank you.
You know, we've been watching your country as it's gone through an incredibly difficult period with coronavirus, as well as an incredibly difficult period with the economy, the worst recession of Brazil's history. For us, it feels like this has been very badly managed by your government. Is that the way it feels for you on the ground right now?
Well, I do agree with you, but that's my feeling too. I'm not sure if the people, Brazilian people, is already convinced that the electorate made a bad choice, like electing current president. It's obvious that the government is not managing quite well. On the contrary, by denying truth. It's impossible to deny that people are dying. This is true. See? And he said, well, this is not a little influenza. It's not that. It's different. It's much more dramatic than that. The number of died people is enormous. Every day, increasing, not decreasing. And now it's maybe more stable, the number of deaths, but in a high level. To what extent this will affect the government? It depends on the opposition and the press and to characterize more directly what is the responsibility of the government for the situation. I have been president, so I know that it's not simple. But anyhow, it's difficult to explain how it was possible for the president to be so indifferent with respect to the pandemic.
And my country, of course, has been a very divided, a very polarized country for lots of reasons we've spoken about on this show. Your country increasingly feels very divided as well. They call Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics. Former President Lula is his opposite in many ways. The country feels very divided, very politically angry. There's a lot of fake news, a lot of disinformation. Why is there so much political hatred and disgust in Brazil right now?
Well, in the last years, the division was enormous. As you know, in Brazil, we have lots of people without conditions of life. They have the minimum condition for a decent life. And Lula represents these people some way. So we need someone connected with society. Lula is connected. Bolsonaro as well is connected with low middle class people. So both are representatives of different segments of society. And Lula has the advantage that he came from the people. He was governing in terms of the interests of the majority of the entrepreneurs, but looking people. He made a kind of connection. Bolsonaro was different. Bolsonaro is more small middle class. He's not a man of the elite. Lula is not a man of the elite as well, but Lula is capable to speak to the elite very simply, very, very easily for him, very easily. Yeah, I saw Lula last week. He is convinced that he will be again candidate. I don't know if he will have the possibility to perform as a good candidate.
No, I see the polls right now, of course, are showing that Lula would win if there was such a match. But right now is the depth economically and the pandemic. The election's not till next year. It's hard to imagine. When you saw Lula, I mean, this is a man who, of course, had been convicted. He was under house arrest, massive corruption scandal. Now, does he feel, when you saw him, did he feel completely vindicated? Does he feel like he is a man of destiny? What was his personality like at the time? How is he doing right now?
I know Lula well for a long time. And Lula, from that time on, he is convinced that he has a destiny. Be the leader of the nation. Still. If you talk to him, as if he never was put in jail. He never assumed he has some responsibility in the events in the past. He will try to insist on his innocence, and as well as he has a strong party, the working class party. Is really very powerful as an organization because they need him. It is a kind of banner for them. It would be more prudent not to be candidate. But Lula is not a man who respects prudence.
I want to ask you a broader question about Brazil's democracy. I mean, with the years of the corruption scandals, are we starting to see, never mind the political divide, but are we seeing the erosion of Brazil's democracy more broadly? Is that happening in your mind?
Well, I think that democracy, in the sense of liberty, is rooted in Brazilian society as liberty. But there is no connection between the parliament and freedom. The parliament is considered as people which are capable of maneuver, not necessarily in favor of the people. So it opens space for demagoguery You see?
In my country, of course, Trump lost the election. He was incapable of admitting that he lost the election, did everything he could to delegitimize that, has caused a lot of damage for the Republicans and the U.S. If Bolsonaro were to lose, and I know it's close, is he capable of admitting that he lost an election?
I think that Bolsonaro, in his mind, I never met Bolsonaro in my life. I never saw him. And I was senator, minister, president, never. He was not considered as a political actor. Now, Bolsonaro is not against democracy in his mind. That's not the way. He came from the army, but he's a representative, was a representative. He deals quite well in terms of within the Constitution. It's different. But he's not acting against institutions.
You're the most important living political figure in Brazil. Is it strange for you that Bolsonaro's never reached out to meet with you personally?
Yeah, it is strange. But this is strange in a double sense. It's also strange that I never noted him. Yeah? This is also my fault, my problem, not to recognize the possibility represented by Bolsonaro. And so this is difficult for me to understand sometimes what is changing in society in Brazil. And Bolsonaro represents the new middle class, which in the past has no importance, but now they have importance. They are numerous. Bolsonaro is more focused on the low classes. He represents the small middle class.
So let me ask you another question that wasn't around to the degree that it is today when you were president, and that's climate. You know, Brazil also in the news in the last year and will be again with all of these forest fires and the clear cutting of the Amazon forest. And, you know, an issue that really has set Brazil apart from a lot of the rest of the world. How do you see that issue? How do you see the rest of the world coming to Brazil now and saying, you're not being responsible, you need to do more?
Well, my mother was born in Manaus, in the Amazon. Yeah. So for me, the Amazon has a specific signification, you see? And I was very close to the, all the climate change problems and so on and so forth. I would say that's not the average people in Brazil. The average people don't look after the Amazon as a wealth or a problem. And the Amazon represents both. It's a wealth and a problem. You see? You have to keep the Amazon going on. I think that Brazil is now becoming more and more blamed by other countries because it's not responsible vis-a-vis the climate. And this is a pity. I think Brazilians should understand the importance of it, to have the Amazon, and not just to use the Amazon as an instrument. But I don't know if this will affect elections in Brazil. So probably all this will be more and more. There are actions, organizations looking after the necessity of taking into account the environment. But that's not yet a political issue in Brazil. It's a political issue in the foreigners, for the Europeans and Americans and the world in general. They look after us and look, wow, we are destroying the nature. But there is not self-consciousness of the problem.
President Cardoso, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Bye-bye.
So that was the big picture look at the political scene in Brazil today. But what has life been like for the most vulnerable people there? Here, a report from one favela outside of Brazil's capital.
Meu nome é Marcos Vinícius de Jesus Moraes, sou morador de Ceilândia, Brasília, Distrito Federal, tenho 49 anos, sou rapper há 32 anos, comecei fazendo rap em 1989, aos 18 anos. O clima, terra de louco, solto, destrua o asfalto. Deu ruim pra burguesia, olho clínico travando um rato. Aos invejosos dá licença, tô vivão nas track. Rap juvenil, distorce o beat, fumaçando o clap. Renova o set, antenado com os moleque. Dormiu de vacilão na cena, acordou marionete. Japão na pista, analisa, atropela, rima. Som que pra covarde é veneno, injeta. E pra mim, o rap e o hip hop me ensinou a trabalhar em prol da comunidade e das pessoas da comunidade. Estamos vivendo um momento muito tenso, não somente no Brasil, mas no mundo todo. E o papel do hip-hop, no aspecto político e social, é cuidar do próximo. Não vou focar no seu fracasso, que suplica a glória, pois quem só ramela se engasga com uma própria história. Quem conhece o meu trabalho, sabe que eu já faço trabalho social há bastante tempo, há muitos anos. Todo final de ano, eu e a minha mãe sempre fizemos a arrecadação de alimentos pro Natal. Em 2021, eu resolvi fazer, entendeu, novamente essa campanha, mas agora direcionada às populações, às pessoas com necessidade, com vulnerabilidade gigantesca.
Obrigada, viu? Mais uma vez. Estou tendo a ajuda de várias pessoas que realmente se importam, que são amigas mesmo. Por mais que está tendo ajuda, não está sendo suficiente. Muitas pessoas estão morrendo de fome, não é dessa doença, mas é de fome mesmo. Penso exatamente nos meus filhos. Eles passar um dia sem comer, isso aí dói muito no coração. E a fome tem pressa.
Só quem sentiu fome sabe o que é sentir fome. Então eu estava em casa e resolvi utilizar a minha rede, as pessoas que me seguem nas redes, para fazer essa campanha. E toda vez, quando eu entrego uma cesta, tem uma história de pessoas que falam: eu tinha isso, eu tinha aquilo, hoje eu não tenho nada. E é muito triste. A maioria das pessoas que moram na periferia, elas encararam a Covid como algo passageiro. Elas tinham dentro de si que era algo mais grave, só que elas não quiseram aceitar. Pessoas e pessoas foram morrendo, e hoje as pessoas que estão morrendo estão do lado delas. Então hoje elas têm noção do quão grave é a Covid, de o quão grave é esse vírus. O que eu estou fazendo é devolvendo tudo que eu sou, porque eles me colocaram na posição onde eu me encontro. Então hoje eu só devolvo para eles tudo que eles fizeram por mim. E você vê que hoje, na capital do Brasil, essas pessoas estão passando necessidade. É cruel.
Now it's time for something a little lighter. Puppet regime.
Hello, Mr. Bolsonaro. It seems like things are not going great. Are you worried? Ha! What do you mean? Things are going fantastic. Just look around. I mean, yeah, it looks like right behind you, everything is on fire. Yes, that's the Amazon, burning. A beautiful, beautiful sight. Don't you just love it? Okay, well, the pandemic is still raging down there with no end in sight. Don't you want some international help with that? No, the French president's wife is ugly. Joe Biden is a loser, and China is a communist. All of them. We don't want their help. Okay, Mr. President. Well, aren't you worried about anything right now?
What was that?
Mr. President, are you still with us?
No! I mean, no! It can't be! It's...
Folks, it's the popular left-wing former President Lula, out of captivity. Him versus Bolsonaro is like King Kong versus Godzilla.
You tried to lock me up on bogus charges, but now I'm back.
King Kong, I will destroy you!
Not this time.
That's our show this week. Come back next week, and if you like what you see, you want more Brazil coverage. Maybe you're sick of Brazil coverage. Maybe you'd like to see other countries covered. We can do that. That's right. Take a minute to sign up for GZERO's most excellent morning newsletter. It's called Signal.